Hi, I'm David Carpenter. Welcome back. And this is November 1st, 2012. And if you've been listening to the news, you know exactly what's going to happen in about 5 days. We have a major election coming up in our country. Well, here at the Gateway Channel, we're not scared to talk about religion, and we're not scared to talk about political issues either. We're going to talk about one today on the November edition of Gateway Plus. Thank you again for joining us today for Gateway Plus for this November 1st, 2012. In a poll last week, we asked participants to list what they believe to be the top issues among Christians in the coming elections. Here are the results. Number one issue, sanctity of life, 35%. Number two, constitutional rights with 31%. Issue number three, traditional marriage, 17%. Number four on the list was Israel with 15%. And rounding out the bottom, believe it or not, as far as issues among Christians, was the economy at 2%. Well, today we're going to talk about the issue that came up fourth on this poll, but certainly an important issue for Christians and an important issue in the election coming up, and that is about the nation of Israel. I'm pleased to introduce to you my guest today, a longtime personal friend and a very wise gentleman, a pastor here in the St. Louis area. Would you welcome my friend Dr. Ed Bragg? Dr. Bragg, thank you so much for coming. I have followed what you are doing with Israel, and we respect your wisdom and your knowledge that you have about this subject. And we are just now is the time.
Amen.
And appreciate you bringing the flag here of Israel. And the blue is just beautiful there. Notice how well it ties in with our set and everything. But we want to hear what you know and kind of tap your mind and tap your brain a little bit about Israel.
Thank you, by the way, for having me. I appreciate it very much.
We are thrilled. It's our honor to have you as our guest. Let's start with the Bible. That's a good place to start. What does the Bible say about the nation of Israel?
Well, Dave, we have to go back to Genesis chapter 12. And Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, is where God spoke to Abram before he even changed his name to Abraham. And he said, in fact, it says in verse number 2, I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And it goes on to say in verse 3, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And then again in chapter 17, God reiterates that same covenant, only he puts a stronger seal on it when he changes Abraham's name to Abraham, and says that you will be the father of many nations. And he said you will produce kings. And then in verses 1 through 9, I believe, it speaks about the covenant. In verse 9, it specifically says, and the land shall be yours for an everlasting covenant. God promised the nation of Israel, the land as well as the people, would be his for an everlasting covenant. Now, that's the beginning of the nation of Israel some 4,800 to 5,000 years ago.
Theologically, you would call that the Abrahamic covenant. And that was the beginning of a unique relationship that God established with Israel.
Yes, sir.
And in that, God, I suppose you would say in a sense, promises to take, he says, whoever takes good care of Israel, I'm going to take good care of them. And don't mess with my people, because if you do, I'm going to be pretty upset with you. Is that your sense of the scripture?
That's absolutely correct. And that covenant has never been changed or altered. The promise in Genesis 12, verse 3, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That promise is still in existence today. It's still relevant to today. And so God did make a special relationship with His chosen people, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people.
And that goes back, you gave the date of that, 4,800?
4,800 years ago.
More or less?
Yeah, more or less.
We don't know the exact chronology,
Right,
but
right.
pretty good idea. 4,800 years, and the same God that made that covenant back then said, I am the Lord thy God, I change not.
Correct.
He's not going to alter. Covenant is, I suppose, and correct me if my understanding, because you're the expert on this, but more strong than a legal, a binding agreement. It's something that is unalterable.
Unalterable, absolutely, absolutely. The covenant, especially made with God and God establishing that covenant, it's stronger than just a contract or a document. It is a binding. God considers it binding to Himself forever. And that will not change.
And God values His good name, and I think He's saying, I'm staking my name on
That's
this.
exactly right.
The infallibility and the reliability of this covenant. Now, there are those, and I want you to kind of give us some maybe, we're scared of the term theology, but that's not a bad word. It's just the study of God and what God says. There are those that would say that modern Israel, that has been in the land named Israel for about 60 years, is that right? So coming on 70 years, does not equate to ancient Israel that God made the covenant with. What's your response to that?
Well, again, we go back to the Bible. And the Bible states in the book of Isaiah, in fact, it's amazing. The entire Old Testament is a record of Israel's history and how that they were promised the land and then turned their back on God. And God did judge them, but He's never changed His covenant with them. And there were other nations that that took over Israel or invaded Israel, but His promise was still there to them and to the remnant. He promised in the book of Isaiah, several hundred years before 1948, before they became a nation again, or I should say the world recognized them as a nation again under the UN resolution. It was May 14, 1948, when they became a nation in the world's eyes. God started regathering people back almost immediately after the Babylonian captivity. In the book of Isaiah, chapter number 43, it says, Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honorable, and I have loved thee. Therefore will I give men for thee, and people for thy life. Fear not, for I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east. Now, God doesn't make any mistakes in His Bible. And when He gives the order in which they would return, Pastor, they returned in the exact same order. He said they'd first come from the east, and almost immediately Nehemiah and his group came back to restore the temple from the east. Then it says, and I will gather thee from the west. In the late 1800s, there were a group of European Jews that came to the shores of what is now called Tel Aviv, and they purchased a piece of property from the Bedouins that owned it or were abiding on it at that time. It was their land, and now they bought it back, and they started building a city which is now Tel Aviv, and they would be considered Israeli pilgrims. And then it goes on to say, and I will say to the north, give up. The north, the Russian Jews came back in the middle 1990s. They immigrated back to Israel. And then it says, and to the south, keep not back, bring my sons from far, and my daughters from the ends of the earth. God prophesied that the people would come back. The land has always been God's land and always been God's people, the people of God, their land, but God brought the people back one by one. When I was in Israel in 2008, we were walking the streets of Tel Aviv, and we saw some of the Somalian immigrants that had come back, and from Ethiopia, the Jews from the south. And it brought my mind back to this scripture, how God brought them back in the exact order that He said He would.
Wow.
And that is thrilling.
You know, somebody said once, you can watch the TV news, see what happened today. You can read the newspaper and find out what happened yesterday, but you can read the Bible and find out what's going to happen tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Now,
absolutely.
The geographical boundaries of Israel today, in comparison to the land that God originally promised them, there's a pretty big difference there,
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes, sir.
They actually have less land today.
They have much less land than they had when the covenant was given. God told Abraham, as far as the east boundary would have been the Euphrates River. The west boundary said the boundary was the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. The northern boundary would be what we would consider near Turkey, and the southern boundary down to Egypt. That area was all the land of Israel given to Abraham as a covenant.
So actually parts of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, maybe,
Part of Iraq.
and parts of Egypt, to modern Egypt today, would actually have been originally the land that God deeded to Israel.
Absolutely correct. That was the boundary given. However, when Joshua took the Israelites into the land to conquer the land, he crossed the Jordan, and they walked through the land and claimed the land that God had given them, from what is Mount Hermon to the north, down to the Red Sea, the tip of the Red Sea, where Elat, the city of Elat, is. And then, of course, the eastern boundary was the Jordan River, and the western boundary, the Great Sea of the Mediterranean Sea. They claimed that land, and for the most part, that was the Davidic covenant, or the Davidic kingdom, and then later Solomon's kingdom. And of course, Solomon's kingdom spread out farther because of his wisdom and the blessings that God gave him.
When the Queen of Sheba came and saw all that, said, "The half has not been told."
That's right.
Let's kind of fast forward a little bit, and didn't mention that maybe we would talk about this. I know this is a very sensitive subject, but the Palestinian issue. Obviously, as Christians, we don't wish any people ill or destruction, but obviously there's something going on over there that needs to be dealt with. Talk a little bit about that, the Palestinian.
Well, the Palestinians, in the ancient history of the Palestine, the whole land was called Palestine, and so there were, believe it or not, there were Jews and Palestinians living together. However, the Palestinians living there knew that the land belonged to the Hebrews, and they knew that it was the Hebrews' land. Bringing it up to today, there are many Palestinians who live in and around Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Many of them want to live in peace and understand that Israel, it's their land. The Vice Prime Minister of Israel said it best when we were speaking to him a couple years ago. He said, as far as humanitarian issues are concerned, the Palestinians are welcome and we will take care of them. But as far as the naturalization of a Palestinian, the land belongs to the Jews, sure, and we must follow the Bible. Many of the Palestinians living there are under the Jewish Jewish observation, as they call it, and Jewish control, and they want to be. It's a few that would want to disrupt Israel, and even farther than that, other former Palestinian leaders have said that they would rather see Israel annihilated and things of that nature, which does not create peace,
No.
but creates chaos.
And you've been to Israel how many times?
I've been to Israel 5 times.
5 times.
Since 2007.
I suppose that it is very true that when you hear the commentary of the media and you pick up on what they're saying, and you actually go to a situation and see it in person, sometimes a very different,
Yes, sir.
Remarkably different situation. Let's talk about the elections. There is seemingly a difference in the two political parties, the two major parties, and then there are also the minor parties. Differences in their platforms and what they say their foreign policy is or would be about Israel. Contrast a little bit as far as what's going on in the American political scene today with regarding Israel.
Well, the Israeli American or the United States friendship and policies have been changing for several years, and I'm going to maybe surprise some of the listeners, but we have not had a pro-Judeo-Christian principled president, I believe, since Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the last president.
Started into that. I said, I bet he's going to say since Reagan, yeah.
Ronald Reagan was the only one, was one of the last presidents that spoke about the Judeo-Christian values. Judeo meaning Judaism, Old Testament. Christian meaning New Testament. And there's a tie there with America and Israel. There has been, our nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, which is the Old and New Testament, or Old and New Testaments. Since that time, there's been a gradual coolness to Israel. Not so much under the Bush administrations, although it was Bush number 2, former President Bush number 2, that pushed the roadmap to peace under Condoleezza Rice, and Israel gave up the Gaza Strip and some of the other West Bank areas. Now those areas are launching rockets into Israel, which was not a roadmap to peace at all. It was more of giving land up to the Palestinians, to Hamas, and then in the northern border to Hezbollah. Though they didn't give up land, there was a war between Lebanon and Israel. And then since the President administration has taken responsibility here in our country, we see a stronger leaning away from Israel. For instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the United States, and President Obama made him wait and was too busy to talk with him, and things of that nature. There are protocols that you follow, and as politicians, and our politicians they're not coming out and saying, no, we won't support Israel. In fact, they're saying they are supporting Israel, but in their actions, they are showing waning away from that decision and from that talk.
It seems to be the hard choice to take a stand for Israel because they are so surrounded by
Correct.
enemies. This administration, and obviously I don't want to be critical, but has been perceived to be somewhat less friendly to Israel, as you cited in a couple of examples there. Secretary of State Clinton, and I do not know how much influence a Secretary of State really has over the President's foreign policy. Does she seem to be about congruent with the President on his position on Israel? Is she a little more friendly or maybe a little less? Do you have any feel on that as far as?
You know, I do not know, but as far as how much she has, I do know what she is doing, and as far as being friendly with many other nations, and being very friendly with the United Nations policies and what they're promoting. The United Nations is promoting. She is very much has spoken out for the two-state solution, both Israel and Palestinian state. That will not work. It will never work. And so she has made that statement. But because of the leaning of the present administration away from Israel, she doesn't have to say anything. Her statement already speaks for itself. She believes in a two-state solution, and that will not work.
And a lot of the lean toward globalism in one of our current policies, would it be fair to say that globalism is not really a friend of Israel?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Globalism is not a friend of Israel, and because of the current economic crises around the world, Europe, China, they say their economy is growing too fast now, and yet Israel's economy is doing well, and God is blessing Israel just like the Bible said. And God is blessing Israel in such a way that nations are jealous, and I believe will be jealous of Israel. They will be a crown jewel there in the Middle East, and that nations will seek after and want. And so globalism is not a friend of Israel. Although Israel, and it's amazing to me, Pastor, how Israel has such a tremendous spirit of cooperation with other people, and yet some who want to annihilate them, and it's very, very disconcerting.
It is. Let me just for fun, throw a little scenario at you. Let's say, mention Secretary of State Clinton. Let's say, and it has been speculated that she might not want to serve a second term if the president's reelected, or say there's a change in administration, and the call comes to you from Washington, and they say, Dr. Bragg, we need some help with our foreign policy advice. We want you to help us formulate our American foreign policy toward Israel based on the Bible. What do you tell them?
Well, that is a loaded question.
Well, you welcome the phone call, first of all.
I would be humbled by the phone call, that's for sure. I wouldn't qualify myself in that area of Secretary of State. But the first thing that I would do is I would reassure Israel that we will be and we are and would be their friend. I would be very careful about how you would cut ties with other nations if you had to. You would certainly want to follow the money trail, and I was listening to the news media the other day, and someone was debating whether or not we should help these struggling democracies. And one of the foreign policy makers was saying, well, we have to help them financially, but we need to watch where the arms or the money goes. And I'm afraid that we're not watching that as closely as we should. And so I would, first of all, start with being a friend of Israel and making sure that our alliance was sure and then and established. And then secondly, I would be careful about helping those who are Israel's enemies. I would be very careful about aiding and abetting.
That's precarious.
That is.
Because we do need to be a friend to Israel. But, and Israel has some very outspoken enemies. We do want to have a peaceful relationship as best we can with Israel's enemies. And it's a tightrope.
It is.
It's a difficult thing for the Secretary of State, for the diplomatic corps, and for all those folks over there. And I hope you folks will remember to pray for folks in that position of authority. certainly there are Christians in the diplomatic corps and Christians working in the Department of State that really do need tremendous wisdom to be able to make the right calls on these day-by-day intricate decisions that have to be made.
Anytime I email or write our congressmen or our senators, the first thing I always do is thank them for their time and sacrifice. I don't think people realize the amount of time away from their families and away from their lives that they give to our nation and to the politics of the world. And I agree with you. We need to pray for them, and I do pray for our elected officials on a daily basis.
It's a difficult place. The recent tragedies in Benghazi and all that reminds us, even our foreign diplomats, that it's so easy to be in a perilous, even life-threatening, and this sadly life-ending situation, to be a part of our diplomatic corps and the folks that make those decisions. Right. God bless them. And,
yes, sir.
Pray for them.
Sir.
You work with a group of folks, I know, and you are interacting with Israel today. And I know Brother Brian Sharp, one of your evangelists out of Lafayette Bible Baptist Church. I got the whole name right. It's like our church have long names. We just call it Gateway for short. But Sharp and Dr. Jim Vineyard, awesome gentleman who I have heard him preach a couple times. I've never had the honor of meeting him in person. But you're working with those guys and some others. Tell us about what you're doing.
Well, in 2004, a gentleman in Ohio, a pastor in Ohio, wanted to help Israel and wanted to stand with Israel. So he contacted Pastor Vineyard, and Pastor Vineyard, Dr. Vineyard, I should say, he's no longer the pastor, but he's an evangelist out of the church there in Oklahoma City, took a group of preachers to Israel, one of them being Dr. Brian Sharp, and they went to the military, to the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, and they just wanted to be a blessing. They wanted to tell them that there's a group of preachers and people in the United States that stands with Israel. And they went to the front lines and fed them pizza and bought them dinners. And
it'd be kosher pizza.
It was kosher pizza, of course. And they fed the troops, and Dr. Vineyard, former Green Beret, and he knew what it was like to be on the front lines. And he said, I was always hungry, so I thought that would be the best thing to do. And that started the relationship with the independent Baptist preachers and a lot of Americans with the IDF. And then Dr. Sharp came up with a tremendous idea of helping the economy there by taking pastors and pastors' wives to Israel in the area of tourism. Israel's economy, much of it runs on tourism, and because of the Lebanese war and other negative media outlets, people weren't going to Israel. And so he started taking groups of 25 and 30 people every February to Israel. I believe he's been to Israel, I want to say 12 times, but Dr. Sharp is planning for a trip this December. It's going to be a little different in that he's taken students with him, and these students will be studying under one of the guides that has been guiding for 20 years in Israel, and they'll see some tremendous sights. They're leaving December 27th and returning January the 4th. For $2,500, they can get all expenses paid, airfare, hotels.
That's a deal.
Meals. The only thing that would cost them is their airfare from wherever they live in the United States to Newark, New Jersey, and then whatever souvenirs they want to buy. That's a tremendous price. And anyone, I think there's a couple spots left on that trip. But then the major trip is in February again, February 14th. It's February 12th through the 22nd, a 10-day trip. And they see over 40 sites. It's $3,600 because of the extra time. But anyone could go if they'd want to call the office. We'd be more than glad to help them.
Give us a phone number if they want to contact.
The office, our office number is 636-225-5225.
Okay.
636-225-50. No, I just said it wrong. 636-225-5225. 5225. That's
All
all.
right. You never call yourself. That's
No, I know, I don't. That's
So if
right.
they were interested in the trips, if they wanted more information about what
Exactly.
you guys are doing over there, and they can get in touch with you. Would they have any websites, anything other way for them to get?
There's a website that Dr. Sharp started. It's called Fullness of Gentiles. Fullness of the Gentiles. If you type in Fullness of Gentiles, you could find it. You could Google it.
Okay.
And he takes that from Romans chapter 11, where the Bible says that the nation of Israel is still God's chosen people.
Excellent, excellent. And hats off to Dr. Sharp and the guys working with you. How's his wife's health doing? Is she doing?
Keep praying for her. Keep praying for her.
We will.
His health has been up and down as well.
I knew he had some problems. I've always especially prayed for her.
They both would appreciate the prayers, and thank you for asking.
We'll do that. And thank you, my friend, for
You're
joining
welcome.
me today.
Thank you, Pastor.
We appreciate taking the time to come over here and to do this. And don't know if we'll swing any votes or not on the election, but to get folks to think.
Yes.
These are key issues. These are important things. They are things that you need to take into consideration, to be aware of, to know what God is doing with His people. And
yes, sir.
Our hats are off to you and your good folks over there at Lafayette Bible Baptist Church in Baldwin. Is that the right town?
It's Manchester,
Manchester.
now. We've been annexed by Manchester.
Oh, okay.
So,
It's like,
yeah.
I asked our good friend, Dr. Wendell Evans, I asked him one time, we were talking about Cologne, and I said, somebody's Cologne. I said, isn't that a city in France? He said, maybe Germany. It just depends who won the last war. So it depends on whoever won the last annexation battle.
yeah, that's right.
Where you
Yeah.
are.
We are in Manchester now.
Good, good. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you as well for those of you, our viewers who joined us today. We hope that you'll pass this information on, share it on Facebook, share it, give it a tweet or a thumbs up or whatever you can do. We want to get the word out so we can get this information out to other folks. Join us as well again next Monday for another edition of Great Day at Gateway. Next Monday will be November the 12th. No, next Monday, sorry, is the day, of course, the day before Election Day. So we'll have an Election Eve special edition. And then 2 weeks, or a week, 2 weeks away, or a week from Monday, we'll have a special salute to veterans on November 12th, day after Veterans Day. So be sure and join us for that. As always, we appreciate your time to join us for Gateway Plus. And that will do it for this edition. Join us again next time on or around, hopefully the first of every month, Lord willing. And we'll see you again for the month of December. Until then, this is David Carpenter on behalf of my guest, Dr. Ed Bragg, saying take care and God bless.